For centuries, it was the riddle that nobody could solve. European explorers, missionaries, and colonial administrators kept returning from this one particular island with reports that made absolutely no sense. They would sit down with local villagers, start learning the language, and realize with mounting confusion that the words these people used for rice, for canoe, for stone, for moon, for the number 5, they were not African words. They were words that belonged to people living on the other side of the planet, 6,000 miles away, across an ocean so vast that most European maps of the era barely attempted to measure it. And yet the linguistic fingerprints were unmistakable. The people of Madagascar were speaking a language that should not exist on an island sitting barely 250 miles off the coast of Mozambique. The case sat open for 400 years. Scholars looked at the evidence, shrugged, and filed it under coincidence. Trading contact, they said. Maybe a few lost sailors blown off course. Certainly not migration. Certainly not colonization. The ocean was too wide. The boats were too small. The reason was too absent. And then, in 2012, a genetics team led by a man named Murray Cox at Massey University in New Zealand finally cracked the case wide open. And what they found was so improbable that it rewrites everything we thought we knew about what ancient humans were capable of. This is the story of how DNA solved a 1,200-year-old riddle, and the answer is stranger than any legend ever invented. I want you to picture the island of Madagascar, fourth largest island on Earth, after Greenland, New Guinea, and Borneo. 587,000 square kilometers of highland plateaus, dense eastern rainforests, spiny desert scrub in the south, and coastal mangrove swamps. It sits in the Indian Ocean roughly 400 kilometers off the coast of Mozambique in East Africa. On a clear day, if you stood on the western shore of Madagascar and looked toward the African mainland, you would see nothing but water. But it's a manageable distance. A few days of sailing in a decent vessel. And for most of recorded history, everyone assumed that was the entire story. Madagascar was populated from Africa. African people walked to the eastern coast of the continent, built boats, crossed the Mozambique Channel, and settled the island. Case closed. Except for one tiny problem that kept nagging at everyone who actually bothered to look closely. The language. Malagasy, the language spoken by the roughly 30 million people who live on Madagascar today, does not belong to any African language family. It is not Bantu, it is not Nilotic, it is not Cushitic, it is not Khoisan. It is Austronesian. Specifically, it belongs to the Malayo-Polynesian branch of the Austronesian language family, which means its closest relatives are the languages spoken in Indonesia, the Philippines, Malaysia, and the scattered islands of the Pacific, all the way out to Hawaii and Easter Island. This is not a subtle connection. The linguist Alexander Adelaar, in a major study published in 2009, demonstrated definitively that the single closest linguistic relative to Malagasy is a language called Ma'anyan, spoken today by approximately 100,000 people living along the Barito River Basin in the southern part of Kalimantan, which is the Indonesian portion of the island of Borneo. Borneo, that's where the trail leads. An island in Southeast Asia, separated from Madagascar by 6,000 miles of open Indian Ocean. 6,000 miles. To put that in perspective, that's roughly the distance from New York to Tokyo. It's nearly a third of the entire circumference of the Earth. And this was not a case of a few borrowed words here and there. We're not talking about the kind of linguistic crossover that happens when traders meet at ports and exchange vocabulary for spices and textiles. The core structure of Malagasy, its grammar, its syntax, its most fundamental everyday vocabulary, is Austronesian through and through. The word for rice in Malagasy is vari. In Ma'anyan, it's bari. The word for stone is vato in Malagasy, batu in Ma'anyan, and many other Indonesian languages. The numbers lima means 5 in Malagasy, lima means 5 in Ma'anyan, in Javanese, in Tagalog, and in the languages of Samoa and Tonga on the far side of the Pacific. The word for canoe, the vessel that makes this entire story possible, is lakana in Malagasy. In the languages of island Southeast Asia, you find waka, vaca, banca. These are not trade words. These are the words you use to talk to your children, to plant your fields, to pray to your ancestors. These are the bones of a language, and the bones of Malagasy are Indonesian. The European scholars who first documented this in the 17th and 18th centuries were baffled. The Dutch explorer and trader Frederik de Houtman compiled one of the earliest known word lists comparing Malagasy to Malay in 1603, and concluded that the two languages were demonstrably related. Other observers over the following centuries kept adding to the pile of evidence, and it wasn't just language. The material culture of Madagascar was screaming Southeast Asia at anyone who cared to listen. The Malagasy cultivated rice in flooded paddies, using techniques that were virtually identical to those practiced in Borneo and Sulawesi. Their signature musical instrument, the valiha, is a tubular zither made from bamboo with strings raised on movable bridges, tuned to scales that musicologists recognized as belonging to the Indonesian gamelan tradition. Their outrigger canoes, the very vessels that made life on an island possible, were constructed with lashed lug technology, a boat-building method that originated in island Southeast Asia and was carried by Austronesian people across the entire Pacific. The frame is carved with protruding lugs, the planks are shaped and drilled, and then the whole structure is lashed together with natural fiber cordage, creating a flexible, seaworthy hull that can absorb the shock of ocean swells without cracking. African boat-building traditions use different methods. The Madagascar outrigger canoe was an Indonesian invention, pure and simple. So the evidence was sitting there in plain sight for centuries. The language, the rice, the boats, the music. Every serious observer who spent time on the island came away convinced that there must have been some ancient connection between Madagascar and the Indonesian archipelago. But the scholarly establishment resisted. Hard. The geography was too daunting. 6,000 miles of open water with no intermediate landfalls of any significance. The prevailing winds and currents in the Indian Ocean, while seasonally favorable in certain directions, still made it a brutal crossing. And there was no historical record of any Austronesian expedition setting out to colonize Africa. No chronicle, no inscription, no royal decree from any Javanese or Sumatran or Bornean kingdom announcing a voyage to a new land. The whole idea seemed like a historical impossibility. So the academic consensus defaulted to the more comfortable explanation. The Malagasy must have come from Africa, and any Indonesian cultural elements had arrived later through incidental trading contact. Arab or Indian, or even later European ships might have picked up island Southeast Asian sailors somewhere along the way and deposited them on Madagascar's shores. That had to be it. The alternative, that Austronesian people had deliberately sailed 6,000 miles across the Indian Ocean to colonize an uninhabited island, was simply too fantastical to take seriously. For 4 centuries, the case remained open and unsettled, the linguistic and cultural evidence relegated to the status of an intriguing but ultimately explicable anomaly. And then genetic science finally got good enough to ask the question directly, and the answer blew the door off its hinges. Let me introduce the detective, Murray Cox, a computational biologist and population geneticist based at Massey University in New Zealand. Cox and his colleagues were interested in a very particular kind of genetic evidence, the kind that preserves the deepest history of human migration in a form that does not get scrambled with every generation. They were looking at mitochondrial DNA. Most of your DNA, the 23 pairs of chromosomes in the nucleus of every cell, gets reshuffled every time a baby is conceived. Half comes from the mother, half from the father, and the 2 copies recombine in a process that makes tracing deep ancestry through nuclear DNA a complicated statistical puzzle. But mitochondrial DNA is different. Mitochondria are the tiny energy-producing structures inside your cells, and they carry their own separate ring of DNA, inherited exclusively from your mother. Your mother got hers from her mother, who got hers from her mother, stretching back in an unbroken maternal chain across thousands of generations. Mutations accumulate in mitochondrial DNA at a relatively steady rate over time, and because there is no recombination to mix things up, these mutations act like a molecular clock, allowing geneticists to estimate how long ago 2 maternal lineages diverged from a common ancestor. If you want to trace ancient migrations, mitochondrial DNA is one of the best tools in the forensic toolkit, and Murray Cox's team was about to use it to solve the Madagascar mystery once and for all. The study was published in 2012 in the journal Proceedings of the Royal Society B, and its title was deceptively understated. A small cohort of island Southeast Asian women founded Madagascar. The team analyzed mitochondrial DNA samples from 266 Malagasy individuals drawn from multiple ethnic groups across the island. They sequenced the hypervariable regions of the mtDNA and classified each sample into known haplogroups, which are the major branches on the human mitochondrial family tree. And right away, the results confirmed what the linguists and musicologists and boat experts had been saying for hundreds of years. The Malagasy mitochondrial DNA was a roughly even split between 2 deeply divergent source populations. Approximately half the maternal lineages traced back to Africa, specifically to Bantu-speaking East African populations, bearing haplogroups like L0, L1, L2, and L3. These are the classic sub-Saharan African lineages, widely distributed across the continent, and their presence in Madagascar made perfect geographic sense. Africa was right next door. But the other half of the maternal lineages traced somewhere else entirely. They traced to Southeast Asia. Haplogroups like B40101, a close cousin of what geneticists call the Polynesian motif, plus B4C, M7, and other lineages that are distributed throughout island Southeast Asia, the Philippines, and the Pacific, but are effectively absent from mainland Africa. The Malagasy were carrying maternal DNA from Borneo, from Sulawesi, from Java. The question of whether there was an Austronesian genetic contribution to Madagascar was answered. Yes. Unequivocally yes. But Cox and his team were just getting started. They now had a set of mitochondrial lineages in their Malagasy samples that they could confidently identify as Austronesian in origin. All the women carrying those lineages were the direct maternal descendants of the original Indonesian settlers who had arrived on Madagascar generations ago. The next question was the one that the statistical modelers on the team were most excited to answer. How many founding mothers were there? When you have a sample of mitochondrial DNA sequences from a population, you can apply a technique called coalescent-based statistical modeling to reconstruct the demographic history of those lineages. The basic idea is this. If you work backward in time, any two mitochondrial lineages eventually converge on a common ancestral mother. The shape of the resulting tree, the branching patterns, and the timing of the coalescence events contains information about the size of the ancestral population at different points in the past. A large founding population will produce a tree with many deep branches representing many distinct maternal lineages arriving at the same time. A tiny founding population will produce a much simpler tree structure. Cox and his colleagues ran Bayesian coalescent simulations on the Austronesian-origin mtDNA sequences in their Malagasy dataset, fitting the observed genetic diversity to models with varying founding population sizes. They cranked the numbers through the computational pipeline and waited for the posterior probability distributions to emerge. And when the results came back, they had to check them multiple times to make sure there was no error. The 95% confidence interval centered on approximately 30 women. 30, not 30,000, not 300. 30 individual women arriving on outrigger canoes after sailing 6,000 miles from Borneo approximately 1,200 years ago became the maternal ancestors of every single Austronesian-origin mitochondrial lineage carried today by tens of millions of modern Malagasy people. Let that number settle in for a moment. A founding population of roughly 30 mothers gave rise to half the ancestry of an entire nation. And remember that 22% of all Malagasy tested carried a specific mitochondrial DNA sequence variant that Cox's team dubbed the Malagasy motif, a marker found in Southeast Asians, but almost never in mainland Africans. That single sequence variant traces back to just a handful of those original 30 women. The genetic bottleneck was breathtakingly narrow. This tiny group of Austronesian women made landfall on an island 4 times larger than Ireland, an island that no human being had ever set foot on before, and over the next 12 centuries their descendants multiplied and intermarried with later African arrivals, until their combined genetic legacy shaped the genomes of 30 million people. The magnitude of the improbable achievement is difficult to overstate. These women crossed nearly a third of the Earth's ocean surface in wooden outrigger canoes, navigating by star knowledge and ocean swell patterns, with no compasses, no sextants, no written charts. They carried with them rice seed, root crops, and the cultural knowledge to build a functioning agricultural society from scratch on an uninhabited island. And they succeeded so completely that their language, their music, their boat designs, and their farming techniques define Malagasy identity to this day. The dating of the arrival also came out of the genetic analysis with remarkable precision. The molecular clock built into the mitochondrial DNA mutations, calibrated against known archaeological and historical benchmarks, placed the arrival of the Austronesian founding population at roughly 1,200 years ago, corresponding to around the year 830 CE. The confidence intervals from the Cox 2012 study put the window somewhere between 400 and 830 CE, and subsequent research would sharpen this picture further. In 2014, a team led by Denis Pierron at the University of Toulouse published a genome-wide analysis in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, focusing on the Maikia, a traditionally forest-dwelling group in Madagascar, often considered descendants of the earliest inhabitants. Piron's team looked not just at mitochondrial DNA, but at the full nuclear genome, which allowed them to study the patterns of admixture, the mixing between the Austronesian and African ancestral populations. When two genetically distinct populations come together and intermarry, the chromosomes of their descendants become mosaics, long segments of Austronesian-derived DNA and long segments of African-derived DNA, spliced together by recombination. Over successive generations, the segments get broken into shorter and shorter pieces. By measuring the average length of these ancestry segments in the genomes of living Malagasy people, Piron's team could date the moment when the two populations first began to mix. The answer came back at roughly 1,000 years ago, perfectly matching the timeline from Cox's mitochondrial study. The Austronesians arrived first, around 830 CE. Within a few centuries, Bantu-speaking East African populations began arriving on the western coast, likely through trade contacts and gradual maritime migration across the Mozambique Channel, and the two populations began to intermarry, creating the admixed Malagasy genome we see today. And here's where the story gains additional texture and nuance. The admixture was not uniform across the island. Another major study from the Piron group, published in 2017 in POS, sequenced 700 Malagasy individuals drawn from 257 villages spanning the entire geographic range of Madagascar. They documented in high resolution how the African and Austronesian ancestry components are distributed across the landscape, and the pattern tells a vivid story about how the colonization unfolded. The highlands of central Madagascar, the region around the modern capital Antananarivo, which is the traditional homeland of the Merina people, show the highest proportion of Austronesian ancestry. The Merina carry roughly 70% Southeast Asian genetic heritage. These are the descendants of the original settlers who pushed inland from the coast and established agricultural communities in the cooler, more temperate highland valleys, where they could practice their traditional rice cultivation techniques. On the coasts, the pattern reverses. The Betsimisaraka people of the east coast, the Sakalava of the west, and other coastal ethnic groups carry a higher proportion of African ancestry. The African arrivals came later, and tended to establish themselves in the coastal lowlands, engaging in trade, cattle herding, and maritime activities. The geography of Madagascar's genetic landscape is a map of its settlement history, with the Austronesian signal strongest at the island's elevated core and the African signal concentrated along its perimeter, and varying degrees of admixture everywhere in between. The Y chromosome tells a complementary but distinct story. While mitochondrial DNA traces only the maternal line, the Y chromosome, passed exclusively from father to son, illuminates the paternal side of the ancestral equation. Studies led by Matthew Hurls in 2005 and François-Xavier Ricot in 2011 painted a clear picture. Approximately 40% of Malagasy men carry Y chromosome haplogroups of Southeast Asian origin, specifically O1A and O2A, the classic Austronesian male lineages found from Taiwan to Samoa. Approximately 50% carry E1B1A, the signature Bantu-associated Y chromosome lineage of East Africa. The remaining 10% represent minor contributions from other sources. The paternal lineage frequencies are roughly balanced, mirroring the autosomal genome as a whole, but with a subtle asymmetry that geneticists have noted. The maternal ancestry skews more strongly Austronesian, while the paternal ancestry is more evenly split. This pattern is consistent with a scenario where the initial founding population was predominantly Austronesian, with both men and women making the 6,000-mile crossing. But subsequent male-biased African migration, perhaps traders and sailors who arrived on the coasts and intermarried with the Austronesian-descended population, shifted the paternal balance over the succeeding centuries. Further genetic detective work in 2016 sharpened the geographic origins of the Austronesian founders even more precisely. Pradiptajati Kusuma and colleagues published a paper in Scientific Reports titled Contrasting Linguistic and Genetic Origins of the Asian Source Populations of Malagasy. By comparing the Malagasy genetic data to genome-wide datasets from across island Southeast Asia, they were able to pinpoint the strongest genetic affinity not just to Indonesia in general, but specifically to the island of Borneo, and even more specifically to the region of southern Kalimantan inhabited by the Ma'anyan-speaking people. This was a stunning confirmation of the linguistic evidence that Adelaar had assembled years earlier. The language closest to Malagasy is Maanyan. The genetics closest to the Austronesian component in the Malagasy genome come from the same population that speaks the language closest to Malagasy. The genetic and linguistic signals align with extraordinary precision, pointing to a founding event that drew primarily from the Burrito River region of Borneo, with additional smaller genetic contributions detected from Sulawesi and possibly Java. The case was converging on a single, coherent narrative from multiple independent lines of evidence, each reinforcing and corroborating the others. So the who and the when and the where were coming into focus. A small group of Austronesians, predominantly from the Maanyan-speaking area of southern Borneo, with possibly a few individuals from Sulawesi and Java, sailed their outrigger canoes across 6,000 miles of open Indian Ocean, arrived on the shores of Madagascar around 830 CE, and established a colony that would eventually grow into the Highland Merina kingdoms and, through later admixture with arriving Bantu East Africans, into the diverse Malagasy population of today. But one gigantic question remained, the question that had been haunting this whole story since the first European scholars started puzzling over the word lists in the 17th century. Why? Why did they do it? Why would a group of people from Borneo, living in an archipelago of thousands of fertile, resource-rich islands, decide to build canoes, load them with rice seed and their families, and sail into the vast emptiness of the Indian Ocean? What possible motivation could justify the risk? And if it was not a deliberate voyage, if they were blown off course by a storm and drifted helplessly for months across the sea, how did they carry the seed stock, the agricultural tools, the cultural knowledge, and enough reproductive-age women to found a viable population? The accidental drift voyage theory strains credibility when you consider the logistical requirements of establishing a self-sustaining colony. You need both men and women. You need crops that can grow in a new climate. You need knowledge of boat building, house construction, and social organization. The arrival on Madagascar was not a shipwreck. It was a planned colonization event. But planned by whom, and for what purpose? The historical record offers no direct answer. There are no surviving documents from the Srivijaya Empire, the dominant maritime power in the Indonesian archipelago during the relevant period, that mention a colonizing expedition to a far western land. The Austronesian sailors who made the journey did not leave written records of their own. What we have instead is a set of hypotheses, each plausible within the broader context of what we know about the medieval Indian Ocean world. The first hypothesis centers on trade. By the 9th century CE, the Indian Ocean was crisscrossed by a vibrant network of maritime commerce. Arab, Persian, Indian, and Southeast Asian merchants were moving goods across thousands of miles of sea lanes. The Srivijaya Empire, based in Sumatra, controlled the Strait of Malacca and was heavily invested in the trade between China and the West. Cinnamon, cloves, nutmeg, and other valuable spices from the Indonesian archipelago were in high demand in markets from the Middle East to Europe. It is possible that Austronesian sailors, familiar with the monsoon wind patterns of the Indian Ocean, were exploring westward in search of new trading opportunities. They may have discovered Madagascar, recognized its strategic potential, and established a colony to serve as a way station or trading outpost. The island sat along the route connecting East African ports like Kilwa and Sofala, with the broader Indian Ocean trading network, and it offered abundant natural resources, including hardwoods, minerals, and agricultural land. The second hypothesis proposes a different kind of motivation, not opportunity but escape. The Srivijaya Empire was an aggressive expansionist power, and its rise to dominance in Sumatra and the Malay Peninsula involved considerable political violence and displacement. Subject peoples, including the Maanyan in Borneo, may have faced taxation, conscription, or cultural suppression under Srivijaya hegemony. Some communities may have chosen to flee rather than submit, loading their families and possessions into their outrigger canoes and seeking a new home beyond the reach of the empire's naval power. The ocean, in this scenario, was not a barrier but a refuge. The very vastness that made the voyage so terrifying to later European imaginations might have been precisely what made it attractive to a community seeking isolation from political pressure. Once you had sailed far enough west that no Srivijayan patrol vessel could find you, you were finally free. Madagascar, uninhabited and fertile, would have been an ideal sanctuary. The third hypothesis acknowledges a possibility that we may never be able to rule out entirely, that the initial discovery was indeed accidental, and the colonization came later. It is not impossible that a fishing or trading vessel was caught in an unseasonable storm, blown far off course into the Indian Ocean, and after weeks or months of drifting, made a desperate landfall on the coast of an unknown island. If any of those survivors later managed to return to Borneo, perhaps by catching the monsoon winds blowing eastward at certain times of the year, they could have carried back reports of a vast uninhabited land to the west. And those reports, even if fragmentary, might have been enough to inspire a deliberate follow-up colonization expedition, this one properly equipped with seed stock, tools, and a founding population of both men and women. The genetic evidence that the female founders numbered around 30 is not inconsistent with this scenario. 30 women is too many for a single accidentally drifting canoe, but it's a plausible number for a single deliberately planned colonizing fleet. Perhaps 2 or 3 large outrigger vessels carrying extended family groups. Whatever the precise motivation, the voyage itself was not an isolated anomaly. It was the westernmost thrust of one of the greatest human migrations in prehistory, the Austronesian expansion. This was a 4,000-year maritime odyssey that began on the island of Taiwan around 3000 BCE. From there, Austronesian-speaking people spread south through the Philippines into Borneo, Sulawesi, Java, and Sumatra, eastward along the coast of New Guinea, and then out into the remote Pacific. They reached Fiji and Samoa by roughly 1000 BCE. They settled Hawaii, the most isolated archipelago on Earth. They reached Rapa Nui, Easter Island, the easternmost point of the Austronesian world, marking the farthest limit of their expansion into the Pacific. And they also turned west, crossing the entire Indian Ocean to Madagascar, which became the westernmost outpost of the Austronesian language family. The distance between Rapa Nui and Madagascar is more than half the circumference of the Earth. If you stood on Easter Island and spoke Rapa Nui, and a Malagasy person stood on the western shore of Madagascar and spoke their native tongue, neither would understand the other, but a linguist could show you exactly how both languages descended from the same ancestral mother tongue spoken in Taiwan 5,000 years ago. The Austronesian expansion spanned 210 degrees of longitude, colonized every habitable island in the tropical and subtropical Indo-Pacific, and stands as the most geographically extensive human migration before the modern era. The Madagascar settlement was not a freak accident. It was the final, audacious exclamation point on a 5,000-year tradition of deliberate, technologically sophisticated ocean voyaging. And what of the oral traditions of the Malagasy themselves? When Cox and Piran and Kusuma were publishing their genetic findings in the 2000s and 2010s, they were not discovering something that the Malagasy people had entirely forgotten. The traditional histories of Madagascar speak of a group called the Vazimba, the first inhabitants of the island. According to oral tradition, the Vazimba were the original settlers who cleared the forests, established the first villages, and lived in the highlands before the arrival of later groups. They are described variously as small in stature, skilled cultivators of the land, and possessors of ancient knowledge. Some traditions depict them as semi-mythical forest dwellers, while others treat them as historical ancestors of the Merina monarchy. The archaeologist Luis Paul Randriamarolaza has documented how Vazimba oral accounts preserve details about early land use, irrigation practices, and territorial boundaries that align with the archaeological evidence of the earliest settlement phase. The genetic data now strongly suggest that the Vazimba oral tradition is, at its core, a cultural memory of the original Austronesian settlers. Before the African ancestry component arrived on the coasts through trade and migration, before the admixture that created the modern Malagasy genome, there was a population on Madagascar descended from those 30 or so founding mothers from Borneo. They lived on the island for centuries, developing their distinct Highland culture, speaking their Austronesian language, and adapting their Indonesian rice agricultural techniques to a new environment. The later Bantu arrivals intermarried with them, and the resulting genetic and cultural synthesis became the Malagasy people we know today. But the Vazimba memory endures, carrying the echo of that first improbable voyage across the Indian Ocean into the present. The 2012 study by Murray Cox and his colleagues was the keystone that locked the whole case together. Before their coalescent analysis, it was possible to accept the linguistic and cultural evidence, and yet still hedge on the question of whether there had been a real, large-scale, deliberate migration from Indonesia to Madagascar. After Cox 2012, that hedge was gone. The DNA does not equivocate. 30 women from island Southeast Asia made it to Madagascar 1,200 years ago, and their daughters and granddaughters became the maternal ancestors of tens of millions. The case that had baffled linguists, anthropologists, musicologists, and navigational historians for 400 years was finally closed. The evidence had always been there, visible in the rice paddies, audible in the bamboo zithers, embedded in the everyday words that Malagasy parents spoke to their children. But it took the molecular forensics of mitochondrial DNA to make the proof indisputable and to reveal the scale of human daring and resilience that the story represents. What does this mean for how we should treat dismissed observations and oral histories? The Madagascar case is a humbling reminder that our ancestors were not less intelligent, less capable, or less adventurous than we are. They crossed oceans that we, with all our technology, would hesitate to cross in a small wooden boat. They did so with navigation systems encoded in memorized star patterns, in swell directions, in the flight paths of migratory birds. And they did it not because they were desperate or lost, but because the human impulse to explore, to find new land, to build new communities, is ancient and powerful, and not diminished by the absence of a written record. The scholars who dismissed the Austronesian connection for 4 centuries were not stupid. They were grappling with a claim that seemed to defy everything they believed about the limits of pre-modern maritime technology. But their skepticism was wrong, and the oral traditions, the linguistic patterns, and the material culture were right. When the next historical mystery presents itself, the Madagascar story should remind us to listen more carefully to the evidence that doesn't fit our assumptions. Sometimes the most improbable explanation is exactly what happened. Case closed. The myth was true. The scholars were wrong. If you want more DNA whodunit stories, subscribe. Thank you for watching. See you in the next one. Thanks for staying until the very end. Goodbye for now.